Gently ASMR. And today I would like to share with you 10 things that I learned when I became a part-time wheelchair user. If you would like to hear the story of how I came to have and use the wheelchair that I'm currently sitting in, I'll provide a link to that video. But in short terms, I have an illness which makes it very difficult to remain standing for any length of time. And so, for occasions where I need to stand in line or wait around, I use this wheelchair. So, let's get started talking about the 10 things that I learned when I became a part-time wheelchair user. The first thing that I learned is that people will treat you differently, for better or for worse. It doesn't really matter who you are or what you look like. When you start using a wheelchair with any regularity and not obviously as part of a temporary injury, people just kind of take a different attitude towards you than they had before. And sometimes this means that people are extra kind to you. And sometimes that means that people are extra cruel to you. It kind of seems like it's either or. And it's kind of unusual to experience a completely neutral reaction from non-wheelchair users. So, on the plus side, you might, for example, get jumped to the front of a line by a compassionate assistant in, like, for example, when I was getting my COVID vaccinations, there was a long line out the door, and when I rolled up in my wheelchair, I got skipped to the, not all the way to the front, but to the door, which was very nice. But on the other hand, some people think it's funny to mock disabled people. Some people think it's okay to interrogate you about why you're in a wheelchair and demand to know your medical history. You just get a lot of questions and a lot of interactions with strangers that you would never have otherwise. thing that I learned when I became a part-time wheelchair user is that there are a lot of places that you can't go. And sometimes that the places that qualify for accessible are a total joke. Sometimes places will call themselves accessible if there's like a single space the size of a broom closet where people in wheelchairs can go and you can't go to the rest of it. And sometimes nature trails will call themselves accessible, and then the whole thing is loosely packed gravel, which is pretty much impossible to move around on by yourself, at least in a manual wheelchair. There are just a lot of things that I need to consider when I'm making plans with other people, and I know that it's going to be the level of energy expenditure where I'm going to need to have my wheelchair. So as such, I'm not really the type to ever go to bars or music venues in general, really, because those tend to be really inaccessible. And unfortunately, a lot of really cool places, a lot of small businesses, a lot of old places are just not at all designed with people with disabilities in mind. And there's not really anything that can be done about that because those businesses don't tend to have the money to totally overhaul their space. And I can't really blame them for that, but I will definitely blame large corporations for not making their stuff accessible because there's really no excuse for that. Number 3 is that you will learn things about your environment that weren't noticeable before. The most obvious example of this are the slopes and grades of every little surface that you can be on. Because when you're in a wheelchair, you really feel every little incline, every little downslope, because the level of effort that you put into moving really changes dramatically depending on that level of slope. That's less of an issue for people with power-propelled wheelchairs, but that's something that becomes really, really obvious when you're pushing yourself around manually. There's lots of things about the ground that you notice that you wouldn't necessarily notice before. Any imperfections in the sidewalk become really obvious, and one way that this manifests is when roots are growing in and push up the sidewalk pavement. That can become really disruptive, and in fact it can even be dangerous because severe and sudden jolts in the terrain like that can sometimes cause damage to the small front wheels of a wheelchair. And that's no good. So you really do learn all kinds of things about the ground around you that people would generally not notice otherwise. Number 4 is that being pushed when you're not expecting it is totally terrifying. People almost always mean well when they do this. Sometimes they see me obviously putting in a bit more effort to go up a ramp or hill, for example. And sometimes people think that it's okay to just grab the handles and start pushing. When you don't have permission to do that, especially when you don't let the person know that you're about to grab them, that's really scary. It's about as scary as it would be if somebody grabbed you and took you, because your whole body is out of your control and you're totally at that stranger's mercy, and you have no idea if that stranger has your best intentions in mind. So, I insist, please treat a wheelchair like a part of a person's body and don't touch it without permission. Number 5 is that wheelchairs are seriously expensive. My wheelchair cost about $500, and that is considered to be quite inexpensive for a chair. On the lowest end, for about $100, are the kinds of wheelchairs that you'll usually find in lying around hospitals or at the entrance to stores. Those are usually the free wheelchairs that are provided. Those are super difficult to get around in because they are very heavy and they strain your muscles. And especially when like disabled people with hypermobility or pain issues, that kind of wheelchair can really make those problems worse. So it's unfortunate that the most accessible in price version of chair is one that's really not all that useful for anybody. And I think it's kind of a travesty that is the kind of wheelchair that's the default for elderly people. I think that is cruel. I think it's mean, and I think it needs to be changed. But wheelchairs for people who need them full time can go into the 5-digit range, tens of thousands of dollars, and insurance companies are finicky about who they choose to give coverage to. And so a lot of people like me who do have mobility and only need a wheelchair for specific purposes, people like me have to pay out of pocket. So I'm lucky that I found a chair that works for me that was only kind of expensive. Number 6 is that frequently using a manual wheelchair will make you very strong. Wheelchairs use quite a different set of muscles from what people usually use to get around. And so those muscles that most people don't use end up becoming quite developed. And whether you choose to move yourself with your legs or your arms, especially if you're going in a lot of varied terrain and a lot of up and down, that's really great exercise because you can honestly kind of work out your entire body that way, because no matter which way you're moving, your core is activated. If you're moving with your legs, your calves and thighs are really going crazy, and then if you're moving with your hands, then that's a lot of work in the shoulders and chest and your upper arms. It's when you use a wheelchair regularly, it's really good. It's a great idea to just go out and use it when you don't really need to, because it builds the proper strength to give you enough endurance to go around and have enough energy to do everything that you want to do. Number 7 is that using a wheelchair is generally a lot more difficult than just walking around. There are a couple reasons for this. The first is that accessible paths tend to be relatively out of the way compared to standard entrances. So when you use a wheelchair, you find yourself doing a lot of circumnavigating buildings and walking extra space. People who move around in wheelchairs generally refer to their movement as walking, by the way. It's just kind of easier. And another reason for that is because it activates those different muscles that I mentioned in the last note. Because it is such a different motion from somebody who grew up being used to walking is used to. It's just basically any time that I don't need to use my wheelchair, like if I feel like I'm not going to get dizzy and faint in a particular like grocery trip or something, then I'll probably go without, because it can be kind of a pain, and it's just more convenient to forego it if you don't actually need it at the time. And then number 8. People will try to gatekeep you, especially people who have never had to use a wheelchair before in their lives. When you're a part-time wheelchair user, you'll run into the kind of person who finds it offensive, I suppose, that some people who are not paralyzed choose to use a wheelchair, and they tend to think that any person who is not paralyzed and uses a wheelchair anyway is doing so because they are pulling some kind of scam. And, unless you're actively trying to do some workers' comp fraud, I don't really think doing that would benefit anybody at all. But people will still accuse you of being a faker, of not really needing it, of even taking away mobility aids from people who need it more, as if I stole this from a grandma or something. People will get really upset. Which is really just silly because I don't use my wheelchair for any other reason than to make my life easier and to make doing the things that I need to do possible for me without making myself sick. And I don't really see any reason to be embarrassed for that, and I don't see any reason to answer to those people who insist that I have to be faking. Number 9 is that there are a lot of little ways that using a wheelchair is actually kind of fun. I think the biggest example of that is going on any downhill slope. It is so fun to go down on long, long ramps, and if nobody's coming and there's just a long, expansive pavement before me, sometimes I'll just put my feet up and put my arms up and just go wee all the way down the hill. It's really fun. It's about as fun as going downhill on a bicycle. Another thing that I find really enjoyable is gliding around on really smooth surfaces. One place that I especially notice this is big box hardware stores with the really huge, long cement aisles. Those are fun to go up and down. While using a wheelchair is a pain a lot of the time, there are some silver linings that can make it just a little more fun than just walking around. Also, it's faster than just walking around. When I'm going in a wheelchair, my normal pace is kind of somewhere like between a speed walk and a jog. Because I'm on wheels, I can go really fast. Which I appreciate because I am an impatient person and I like to get places quickly. And my final point, number 10, is that the phrase wheelchair bound is totally inaccurate. No. People who need wheelchairs and who receive access to wheelchairs are freed by them, not bound by them. No, without a wheelchair, you are bound to your home. You are bound to your caregivers. You are bound to a lot of helplessness and inability. But when you have a wheelchair, you are freed from all that when you have mobility challenges. So, I insist that you try not to use the phrase wheelchair bound, because that really doesn't reflect an experience of reality for most disabled people. I really hope that you've enjoyed hearing me speak about the things that I learned when I became a part-time wheelchair user. And I sincerely hope that you have a very, very